what we would recognize as a state. We're going to create rules and settle procedures and settle institutions to deal with those rules, which might be distinguishable ultimately from what we already have now. It seems like there is going to be some kind of evolution, some movement towards having a standardized way of doing this, which would eventually be like a state. You have essentially private groups that became so state-like, it'd be hard to see the difference. Those are just some thoughts. I obviously, I was very impressed. My overall comment should be it was gave a lot to think about and had a lot of interesting and colorful analogies to what's going on. But I'd like to give you the floor back, and
sure.
If you have questions or anything, please.
I want to be first. A couple of historical points relevant to what you were saying, partly supporting, partly not. One of them is on the question of the state defining the rights as opposed to enforcing them. One of my favorite historical societies is Saga period Iceland. And in Saga period Iceland, there was no executive arm of government. There was a legislature and a court system, but all enforcement was private. So that's an example of your case in the sense that what determined that I had the right to kill you was a court system, a monopoly court system. But that court system itself did no exertion of force. Second case is 18th century England, where criminal law was privately prosecuted. And that's a case. The interesting point there is your point about general deterrence. Because you don't seem to have asked the question, why do you need general deterrence? If you are specifically deterred against every individual, isn't that sufficient? And in fact, in 18th century England, one of the puzzles is why people bothered to prosecute. Because in the criminal rather than the civil case, you couldn't collect damages. And the answer is they bothered, part of the answer, I've got an article again on the webpage on 18th century England, is they prosecute for deterrence as a private good. And being ingenious people, they had figured out how to make deterrence private. And what were called associations for the prosecution of felons. Generally, each one limited to a particular town or city. And a bunch of citizens of that city or town would agree to chip in an annual fee for a pool of money that would be used to pay the costs of prosecuting anybody who committed a felony against a member of the association. And the list of members of the association was published in the newspaper for the felons to read. So that's a case of pre-committing to deterrence and thus of converting deterrence to a private. On the general issue of public goods versus private goods, I think you are confusing two almost unrelated meaning of the term public good. Public good in economics describes a feature of the good. You are using it to describe a good the government chose to produce. Governments produce lots of private goods, in the economic sense, and private individuals produce lots of public goods. Indeed, I at least have just been producing a public good, and presumably you as well, because to the extent that the talk results in people being better informed and interesting ideas going out into the society, that will produce a benefit to people who I'm not in a position to charge for that benefit. That's a public good in the economist sense.
I think I meant, and maybe I misused the term, a good that has public externalities that are greater than its market value.
Well, almost all goods have positive or negative externalities.
But greater than.
But the question is there any reason to believe that the imperfections due to the market ignoring the fact that some of the benefit isn't captured are anything close to as large as the imperfections due to the difficulty of running a socialist enterprise, which is what you're doing when the government is running it. Because I wanted, as a sort of the final point, to get to the question of inequality. Suppose you actually look around you and you say, where are people in our society most unequal? And the answer is certainly schooling is one of the major areas. And schooling is a good produced, K through 12 schooling, almost entirely by governments. Police protection is another really big area, produced largely by governments. On the other hand, poor people get to buy the same groceries as rich people. They don't. The grocery store aren't quite as good because it's more expensive doing business in poor neighborhoods, but it's not a big difference. I've lived in neighborhoods where many of my neighbors were poor when I was a graduate student in Chicago. And poor people get to buy about the same clothes as rich people. So I think if you actually look at the real world, if you ask not what is government supposed to do, because if you go back to your comments, a lot of them is the police should do X. If you ask what they do, you want to think of it in terms of the actual incentives on actors in government who we think of as just as privately interested as actors in the market. And then I think you get a much less optimistic conclusion. And finally, on your initial point about norms, from my standpoint, I don't understand morality very well. I'm not sure anybody understands moral philosophy at all. I'm not sure there really are good ways of deriving what people should do. So I would like, if I can, to push my arguments to things I understand. And I would therefore prefer, instead of saying the reason that I don't take that parking place is because I have a moral feeling that it's your property place, to say what my moral feeling really is my internalizing the strategic situation. My having discovered that once something is established as a property right in a certain sense, which partly comes down to people's willing to defend it, that then it is imprudent to violate it. And I've gotten from imprudent to feeling wicked.
You have to call it moral, though. I mean, just to respond, it seems as though the main reason most people obey the law is not because they're worried that they're going to get beaten up or even arrested.
Correct.
They do it because they think the law is correct and legitimate. They've been taught that as a child, but they also have a belief, most people, that the government that made the law is representative, and that they did create that. Okay, but that, I think...
You gave us the counterexample. The inability to prevent the sales of illegal drugs.
Well,
that's a clear case where there's no question but that the government...
I think that's a feeling where it's not legitimate because the government allegedly has overstepped so much in trying to make something illegal.
But it's not because the government isn't democratic. It's not because the government isn't a legitimate government in the normal sense. It's because governments don't make right and wrong. And most people
I think it might affect people's idea of what's right and wrong. I think more people would try drugs if it were illegal. I think you'd have that
we don't know.
Or we don't. But it's hard. I don't want to get into debate.
Yes,
so
sure.
Open it up to people.
But anyway, let's open it up to students. Right. Questions? Surely someone's going to disagree with me. Yeah, or him, or both of us.
I mean, I'm with you as far as in the contract sense. It seems like your examples of way people could form contracts and enforce them. We could do that today. I mean, that does happen today.
You will do it today if you're designing contracts.
I'm less clear on the property example because to me it seems like, yes, I could imagine a lot of ways I could use self-help methods to enforce my property rights. Most of them are illegal. So I mean,
and some of the illegal ones happen. In Shasta County, illegal ones happen. In Chicago, illegal ones happen.
Okay.
But also lots of legal ones. If you just think about the question, the fact that there are lots and lots of contexts in which applying to the legal mechanism is going to cost you more than it's worth. You just think of the amount of your time and energy that's going to go into a police investigation of a crime which they're probably never going to recover your property, say, or go into a suit. Nonetheless, often though not always, people do so. And I would claim that, among other things, the use of the legal system is an example of my territorial behavior, that instead of fighting people with tooth and claw, you're fighting people with lawyers and writs and things. But it's still the case that a lot of the structure of an ordered society comes from the knowledge that there are things people will fight for beyond the short-range value of fighting for them. All right? And that depends on things that people feel are theirs. And one critical issue here, which I didn't get into, is the consistency of those beliefs. That if you have a situation where Group A has one clearly defined set of property rules, Group B has another clearly defined set, and they happen to be living in the same area, then you're going to have a lot of cases where I feel committed to fight very hard to stop a trespass, and you feel committed to stop very hard because you're not trespassing. So I would suggest that one prediction of the general argument I'm making is you're going to tend to have conflicts on borders between different cultural systems for that reason. I go into that, I think, a little more detail in the article. Yeah.
I think the important sort of criticism that came out of Professor Simmons was what of the idea that ultimately the interconnectedness of the compacts turns into law, turns into a de facto state, and is the essentialness of the legitimacy of that, the voluntariness of the subscription.
Yeah. No, I would have said that one of the questions that you have to ask, and it's not an easy question, is what defines a state? What is the difference between a government and other things? And my definition is a state as an agency of legitimized coercion. And what I mean by that, which goes back to this argument, when I originally came up with that, I didn't understand it as well as I think I do now, is that the state is an organization against which people drop their commitment strategies. So that if a private burglar steals my property, I will go to a good deal of trouble to stop him. If the IRS collects taxes which I regard as morally legitimate, I will not shout, "Stop thief," and do those sorts of things. So that in effect, what I think is if you think about the fact that almost everything governments do, non-governments do too. All right, I can't think of an example of something that only governments do. The closest would probably be make war, but even that you've got private examples of war making. So what's the special characteristic of government? The special characteristic of government is that governments can violate what people see as their rights without setting off the kind of responses that normally protect rights.